Welcome to this edition of the Capital Brief. I'm Seth Berenzweig from the law firm of Berenzweig Leonard here in our beautiful BL Media studio in lovely downtown Tysons, Virginia, here with our friend and colleague from RealClearMarkets, John Tamny. John, how you doing?
I'm great. Good to be back.
Excellent, excellent. The rain has parted and the forecast is beautiful for the next 5 days, so we're in a good mood here.
Yes.
But we're going to be talking about not so much a happy topic. One would argue maybe perhaps a little bit of a terrifying one, depending on how you interpret it. But this week was all about China, and there's a lot going on in China. I know that you have been to China, that you know very well the land of China, and there's a lot going on. So let's break it down, because I think there's a lot to discuss. One of the main reasons why China has become such a huge issue of discussion this week in the national media is because of the Evergrande meltdown, where the second largest housing development company in China looks to be really regretting their borrow-to-build model, where they are just massively in debt. And it's just creating some real repercussions and conversations about what's going on in China. John, what is going on in China this week, and is it really a big deal, at least as it relates to what's happening here for our economic prosperity here in the United States?
Well, it depends. If it's Evergrande, businesses in any dynamic economy fail. That's not a negative sign. That's a sign of progress. Let's never forget that in the early 20th century, 2,000 car makers were formed. Most of them died, just about every single one. We saw something again in the early 2000s in Silicon Valley. Dynamic economies are defined by relentless experimentation.
And competition.
And competition. Not all of it works out. And so Evergrande on its own isn't a real story. Businesses overextend all the time. That gives opportunities for, if they go bankrupt, that gives an opportunity for someone else to come in and get good assets on the cheap. The only risk to failure, there's this myth that persists to this day that in 2008 that Lehman caused a global correction. No, government intervention in Lehman's failure and constantly changing interventions caused a global correction. An investment bank couldn't cause a global crisis, neither could Evergrande. And so the danger here is we don't know what China will do, what Beijing will do. We don't know what will be done here in response to this, and that's always the fearful thing, never the failure itself.
So this really seems to be raising the question of, is this China's Lehman moment? And if the United States government had an interest in regulating, I certainly think that President Xi is going to take an interest in certainly considering taking that approach. And as of the time of our taping today, I would say that what's happening there is less than entirely clear. There was an earlier indication that the government was just going to let it collapse under its massive debt load. And now there's a little bit of a potentially rosier picture based upon an encouragement and possible participation by the Chinese government, as well as some global encouragement and encouragement within China to allow some kind of a debt restructuring. But that's very much up in the air. One of the things that I found really interesting in researching this topic, because I'll just say for myself, before this blow up, I really barely ever heard of Evergrande. But when I was going through the topic, the thing that I found so interesting is that not only is Evergrande very overly leveraged, but a lot of the citizens of China are overly leveraged because, given the system of government there are much more limited areas of capital investment opportunity. And a lot of the middle class in China have invested and pre-invested in a lot of the red-hot real estate market, including apartments, many of which were sold by Evergrande. But the problem is that a lot of their capital is tied up, and they have many, many people throughout China that are really looking at potentially being wiped out, not very much unlike what we faced here in the more recent meltdown. But why would a potential seismic financial event in China have any kind of relevance to the day-to-day of the United States and the United States market here?
Well, it would be major here simply because what's good for China is good for the United States. Apple's the most valuable company in the world. It presently sells a fifth of its iPhones, its most profitable and successful product in China.
Okay.
There are 4,200 Starbucks in China on the way to probably tens of thousands if the growth continues.
There are 100 of them on my block, but that's a whole other
That's
story.
right. But it's amazing. You've heard me say this before. You land in China and you feel very welcome as an American because everywhere you look is a U.S. business. There's 3,700 McDonald's. GM sells more cars in China than it does in North America. It's the second largest market for Nike. Goes on and on and on.
Shareholders don't want to see that implode.
Yeah, if China implodes economically, it's going to be felt very intensely here simply because our sales of our greatest companies, a big portion of them are taking place in China. If it were to implode, it would have a very huge impact on the valuation of U.S. companies.
Does China have a systemic, fundamental debt problem? And let me just color that question a little bit. Some of the biggest historic moments of collapse of governments or even failures of military conflict ever since the American Revolutionary War, quite frankly, were situations in which debt was a significant factor. One of the reasons why the United States was able to get France into the Revolutionary War was because France saw that Britain had a crushing debt issue because it was overextended. And there are the limited time in our broadcast, it doesn't allow us to fill in all the examples between then and now. But is there a debt problem in China as you see it?
I don't think so. The only problem usually is when there's not enough debt. I know that runs counter to conventional wisdom.
Okay.
But did the Chinese have a lot of debt in 1978? No. In 1988? No. 1998? Realistically, no. Debt is a consequence of the market's belief that you have the means to pay it back. There's not a lot of debt in Haiti, yet there's tons of it in New York City. There's tons of it in San Jose, California. No one lends with an eye on not being paid back. And so the fact that the Chinese have debt is a sign that the market increasingly believes they have the means, their future earnings rate that debt.
Market confidence.
Yeah, confidence, but it's also a signal no one borrows money. People borrow what money can be exchanged for. And so there's just a lot more production in China, which explains why there's lots of debt. Where there's enormous amounts of production, there's lots of money financing that production. There's lots of market willingness to lend to that productivity. So I don't think it's a risk. People get overextended all the time. That is a fact of life, but on its own, it's not a danger for a country to have people who are heavily leveraged.
Well, it'll be interesting to have a show sometime talking about whether the United States is overly leveraged, and we can have that's too broad of a conversation to have today. That's a separate issue, but certainly that lends to an interesting conversation. But it's difficult to have a conversation about China and the dynamics of what's going on in China and its impact without recognizing the human rights issues in China. Now, one might ask, okay, are you raising that in order to have some kind of a broad political conversation, or are you raising that to have a market-based conversation? I raise it as a market-based conversation, and something I'd like to ask for your impression on because of this. I believe that it has been relatively clear that China has been imposing, and they've made a lot of strides, they made a lot of gains, and they've been scaling quite impressively. However, obviously they are in, for lack of a better phrase, a police state. They have one of the most broad electronic monitoring systems on the planet. We know about the situation with the imprisonment of the Uyghurs and so forth. And the reason why I think that this is relevant, because there is a new trend that is happening in investing, which I'll call the ESG trend, environmental, societal, and G, I believe, is governance, corporate governance. And it's basically a derivative theory of ethical investing. And the ESG trend is really getting hold right now. But you have major investors, including endowment funds for some of the top Ivy League schools, for some of the top pension plans, that are invested in China. From a domestic policy standpoint of how China is running its country from a human rights perspective, and comparing that to the ESG trend in the United States, do you see that indicating any kind of a risk of unraveling from a market perspective over the next 12 to 18 months?
To me, ESG is in many ways, and it's actually another discussion, I think, too. I think to some degree it's a sign of prosperity. Do I like it? Do I like all that stuff? No. But I also think that when you see it here, a lot of it is because companies can say we are going to be ethical. When you're booming, when you're growing, you can appeal to certain segments in the marketplace. Now, I think what you're alluding to here is that while these endowments want ESG and all this high-minded investing, at the same time that we're seeing capital flows to China,
right,
where it's let's be clear, it's not a free country in
right,
the way that the United States is.
Not even
now,
close.
to be fair, I think if you went to Shanghai, you would say it looks pretty darn free. There's no way a shackled people could have created the cities that you see in China. So I think to some degree it's overstated, but undoubtedly that it's not as free of a country as we are. But my response on that is that's why we want to be exchanging with them, trading with them. That's why we want to be the biggest market for Chinese production, because how else can we Americans who love our freedom affect change in another country other than by being a big consumer and being able to make choices? We can then boycott. We can say if there's not change, if there's not better treatment of the Uyghurs, we are going to take our dollars elsewhere. You can't do that if there's no trade going on with another country, and that's why I always argue that trade is the greatest foreign policy concept mankind ever conceived. It gives each side a rooting interest in one another improving.
So when you're talking about the carrot and the stick, obviously, there are many in the United States that are really displeased with what's going on in China from a human rights perspective, including but not limited to the Uyghurs, and obviously that's a factor that's relevant. But by the same token, engagement versus disengagement is going to be one of the best ways to have a continued conversation and a discourse to try to affect change. And withdrawing from China, including divestiture, is something that you believe at the end of the day could be counterproductive in terms of trying to have a role. But can we really do anything when it comes to China? You know, we're talking about things that are very sharply economic, but also political. As you say, when it comes to China, obviously it's complicated. But what can be done from a governance standpoint to try to engage in the best approach to try to maintain positive economic relations with China? And do you think that Washington is either doing that right now or should be doing something differently? Because obviously, as you're pointing out, our relationship with China, we're the two economic superpowers. This is a really big deal.
It's a big deal. To me, what Washington does is almost immaterial at this point. And we saw it under Trump, and we're seeing it under Obama, or under Biden. There's so much talk. Biden's policies vis-a-vis China haven't changed much from Trump's, that they're this, we're going to get tough, we could decouple. Oh, please. You can't do any of those things. Trump talked a big game about separating us from China. But you can't, because there's too much American investment over there. There's too much cross-border trade and investment between the two countries, and some president's not going to separate that. Biden's not going to do the same. So I think from Washington we will get a lot of rhetoric, but I don't think we're going to see much. The more worrisome thing to me is this is us. The United States protectionists have always been able to make noise in the United States. But what we're hearing and what we saw on the front page of the Wall Street Journal this week is that China's president is talking about, if the report is to be believed, that he wants to take China back to some form of Maoism, that capitalism, ultimately, its endpoint is socialism. Well, that's really scary. Under Mao, China was a desperately poor country. It was a murderous country. I think I speak for you because we're roughly the same age. When I was growing up, it was finish your meal, they're starving in China. That's what it was like when Mao was running it. And so it's hard to imagine President Xi taking them back to such a desperate time, but it's something to look after, because if he does, the world is headed for some really shaky times if China retreats like this.
Is she paying lip service because in the first half of next year there's going to be a very large gathering, and you probably know a little bit more about it than I do, but my understanding is that his appointment for a much longer term, if not for life, is something that's going to be more officially locked in next year, and he needs broad-based support in a very large and very complex country. So do you think that that is paying lip service to try to coddle and accommodate folks so that he can get that general favorability, but still carry on as business as usual? Or do you really think that he's being serious? Because if he's serious, the next 12 to 18 months is going to be, it could really present some really significant and clear problems.
I think you hit on a great point that to some degree he seems to be playing politics too, and I hope that's true. Because if it's not, we've already discussed it.
Right.
If China goes in reverse, if it goes back toward Maoism, the biggest non-U.S. market for the most valuable companies in the world, that would be U.S. companies, is going to shrink quite a bit, which would lead to the mother of all stock market corrections.
Right.
The fact that it hasn't already happened seems to support your contention that a lot of this is rhetorical, and it's not something that there's plans to do. You go beyond that. Let's never forget that the greatest driver of economic progress is the division of labor. In short, for the American people, the arrival of the Chinese into the global labor force, this cooperation, has been nothing short of brilliant. Politicians will say they're taking our jobs. No. The Chinese entrance into the global labor force has enabled Americans to upscale their work, specialize it on the way to better and better pay. That's why we are a magnet for the world's production, because we rate that we've got the means to pay for it. And so I think you hit on what's actually happening, that he's got political situations to deal with too, because it would truly be suicidal. All of Xi's dreams of a grand China would be wiped away by going the way of Mao, because it would lead to the country's rapid decline.
Yeah, for Xi, he wants to have China as the most powerful nation on earth. And frankly, if they can keep it together and avert a debt crisis, he's really well on his way, because China is one of the top two economic superpowers. We know that Russia isn't anywhere close to that. They have an economy roughly the magnitude of Italy. So Xi really seems to be really dancing a tightrope right now, because on the one hand, he needs to pay lip service to some of the core communist ideals. I think one of the phrases that he's used a lot over the last week is for advancement of the, quote, common prosperity. And I've seen that said, and every time he uses that phrase, the market shudders for good reasons, because, as you say, a lot of people own stock in Starbucks and McDonald's and Apple and Tesla and so forth, and obviously China's a big deal. But what's going to be happening over the coming months is going to be something that's going to be very critical to watch, because it's going to have a direct impact on, among other things, the stock market here, to see what are they going to be doing in terms of human rights, what are they going to be doing in terms of management of the debt, what are they going to be doing from a military perspective. There have been obviously increased tensions as it relates to Taiwan, Hong Kong. So as we kind of bring this episode in for a landing, what do you think is one of the, or if you were going to pick one of the biggest areas of risk that we're facing for the rest of this year as it relates to China in terms of potential blowback and impact to the United States and the U.S. stock market, what would you identify that to be?
I think it would just be to overreact, to take this too seriously, to meddle. What's the word? China's got political issues to deal with too. We can talk about the mugging of certain businesses, Ant Group, it's all disturbing. But to be fair, and I'm not defending it, that's what we do here all the time. When you grow big in the United States, suddenly you're called before Congress a lot more than you'd like. And so to some degree, what we're seeing is political human nature happen in two very large countries. And so I think it's dangerous to overreact. I think it's also dangerous for Americans to look so askance at this. When in history has there ever been one superpower? Never. There's always been two or three. And to me, much scarier than a China rising economically and rising militarily is a China that's in decline. That's when they've got everything to lose. That's when they're desperate. Right now, if they blow this, everything's wide. If the U.S., if they lose the U.S., if they invaded the U.S., it would quite literally be like Gucci invading Beverly Hills or something. It just would be so anti their their good health. And it's the same idea here.
Well, if Gucci did any invasion, you know that at least they'd be well dressed.
That's right,
and accessorized. Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great point, and I think that you've hit on an element of this story that I don't think is really getting enough attention in the media, because the media tends to, the mainstream media on both and the left and the right, I'm not picking on any one side in particular, tends to really kind of take a myopic view about certain things, what's going on with this debt situation, with this construction company, or what's going on with some of these other elements. My final takeaway on this is that I believe, and you know, when you say it's complicated, I mean, that really is so true. And one of the elements of the challenge and the peril with respect to China really relates, in my view, also, and this is another, at least another half-hour discussion that we don't have time for today, relates to military superiority in outer space and cybersecurity. Cybersecurity, for the obvious reasons that, as we've seen, there have been huge recurrence of hacks, and we have a real, genuine problem with our keeping appropriate and technologically heightened guards up for cybersecurity today. But there are very concerning things that are going on in outer space. Obviously, a lot of that is classified, and no one in this room can know what those are. But there have been some general indications of some real concern by members of Congress and the intelligence committees to the effect that there are some really problematic things going on with respect to satellites, with regard to technology as it relates to orbiting the moon. And those things aren't, frankly, getting much attention either. And we really don't talk about cybersecurity until we have to. In the United States, just like a debt crisis, we're never proactive, we're always reactive. Anyway, John, always great to see you. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Yes.